World of Warfare presents Battle of the Atlantic. Before the bloody days of the First World War, the first German submarine, the U-1, made its initial sea trials by the end of 1906, while the first fully operational U-boat, armed with a single torpedo tube, had managed to complete a 600-mile cruise around German waters in 1908. To the British, the idea of a submarine was looked upon as ignoble and underhanded, leading then First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill to comment in 1914, "I do not believe that this would ever be undertaken by a civilized power." That all changed after the start of World War I on July 28, 1914, when a little less than a year into the war, Germany proved just how uncivilized they could be. On May 7, 1915, RMS Lusitania, operated by the Cunard Line, plied her usual route between New York and Liverpool when she was hit by a torpedo fired from a German U-boat, sinking in 300 feet of water just 11 miles off the southern coast of Ireland. Of the 2,000 men, women, and children aboard, 1,200 would perish after the torpedo found its deadly mark. Arguably one of the most luxurious vessels in the age of ocean liners, the Lusitania sank in less than 18 minutes after the German torpedo tore through her hull. Backlash following the sinking turned public opinion in many countries against the Hun, contributing greatly to the Americans' entry into the war. Argument over whether the ship was a legitimate military target raged back and forth for many years during and after the war, as both sides made misleading claims about the ship's purpose and intent. For their part, the Germans justified categorizing the Lusitania as a naval vessel, since at the time of her sinking, German intelligence claimed that the ship was carrying over 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition, nearly 5,000 shrapnel shell casings, and 3,240 brass percussion fuses, a breach that Great Britain at last admitted to publicly in 1982. The Germans further argued that the Lusitania, like many British merchant ships, routinely violated the internationally recognized cruiser rules, which forbade attacks on civilian ocean liners and non-military merchant ships. The loss of the Lusitania raised the curtain on unrestricted submarine warfare. All enemy vessels became legitimate targets to be attacked without warning, since German war leaders understood Britain's heavy reliance on supplies from her allies in North America. As a result, German U-boat captains were ordered to sink as many Allied ships as possible in the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, leading to the loss of 900,000 tons of shipping in April 1917 alone, a loss that nearly brought Great Britain to her knees, with less than 6 weeks of vital war supplies remaining in her armories and stockades. Gradually, the Allies began to realize that the submarine had completely changed the nature of maritime warfare, forcing them to employ new tactics such as Q-ships, which were warships disguised as merchant vessels, such as scruffy-looking timber ships, tramp freighters, decoy passenger liners, fishing smacks, and slow-moving sailing luggers. Hoisting the colors of neutral nations, Q-ships were fitted with a myriad of deceptive props, while guns were hidden conveniently inside chicken coops and other random deck cargo. When curious German U-boat crews sailed in for a closer look, Q-ship crews would shed their masquerade in a fusillade of deadly gunfire. Q-ship crews also took open advantage of a U-boat's inherent limitations. Carried in limited supply within the tight confines of a U-boat's hull, torpedoes were only accurate from a relatively short distance from their intended target, making them vulnerable to return fire or even ramming should an attacking U-boat surface too soon near an enemy ship. To lure U-boats into their trap, Q-ships conducted staged panic parties, as Admiral Gordon Campbell described in his post-war memoir, My Mystery Ships. Dressed as common deckhands or even women in the case of Q-ship passenger liners, during a panic party, Both crew and passengers would pretend to abandon a sinking ship, opening fire when a U-boat had drawn sufficiently near. Only the reluctant introduction of the convoy system late in the war led to a decline in the numbers of lost merchant ships. By the end of the First World War, almost 6,000 Allied ships had been sunk by submarines, all at a cost of 15,500 merchant and naval sailors, sending a total of 14,200,000 tons of cargo and ships to their watery grave. For their part, the Germans lost 178 U-boats and over 6,000 sailors. Of the many horrific lessons learned during the First World War, Allied war leaders now understood the potential of the submarine as a devastating weapon. God forbid should a second mechanized war ever again raise its ugly head. Such a war did arrive on September 1, 1939, when Adolf Hitler launched a coordinated attack on Poland from the west, south, and north, in clear violation of the post-World War I Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Locarno, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact intended to maintain peace in Europe. Employing Hitler's blitzkrieg, or lightning war tactics, the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe at first laid down an extensive bombing campaign to destroy Poland's air and rail defenses, along with communication lines and munition depots, before deploying a massive land invasion by troops, tanks, and artillery, rapidly incapacitating resistance as they pushed their way across the country. The same day Hitler stormed into Poland, the SS Athenia, sailing under Britain's Donaldson Atlantic Line, departed Glasgow, Scotland for Montreal, Canada, with a cargo of 1,103 relieved passengers, desperate to flee yet another war in Europe. Making stops in Belfast and Liverpool to take on additional passengers, on September 3rd, mere hours after British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain declared a state of war with Germany, at 7:30 p.m., the 26-year-old captain of German U-boat U-30, Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp, gave the order to fire upon the unarmed passenger liner. During the slow 14-hour sinking of the SS Athenia, the HMS Electra and 2 destroyers were able to rescue the majority of the lives aboard the doomed ship, save for 93 passengers and crew, who were either lost in the initial explosion or died in mishandled lifeboats, making the SS Athenia the first British ship to go down in the Second World War. The Battle of the Atlantic and the war against the U-boats had begun in earnest, a battle that would slog on for 68 months and prove to be the longest continuous battle of the Second World War. By the time of Chamberlain's war declaration, Germany possessed 57 U-boats, all built in secrecy and clandestine intrigue, defying the strict limits for German rearmament imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. That same day, newly minted U-boat captain Günther Prien departed a German subbase at Kiel on his first war patrol aboard U-47, a Type 7B U-boat carrying 14 torpedoes, an 8.8-centimeter naval gun, a 2-centimeter anti-aircraft gun, and 33 tons of additional fuel in external tanks, which gave U-47 a range of 2,800 miles. 2 days later, Prien and his crew of 4 officers and 43 men entered the Bay of Biscay, sending the SS Bosnia, Rio Carlo, and Gardavan to their watery graves over the course of a few short days. Returning home to Germany for a well-deserved rest, Kriegsmarine Commander Admiral Karl Dönitz summoned Prien to his office, tasking the young captain with a potential suicide mission involving an attack on Britain's most important Royal Navy base at Scapa Flow, tucked inside the Orkney Islands off the northern coast of Scotland, which had been used as a safe harbor as far back as the Vikings. Departing yet again on October 8, 1939, Prien cautiously approached Scapa Flow through a series of treacherously narrow and shallow channels with fast-moving currents, avoiding block ships and floating booms that the British had put in place after World War I. When Prien and his men finally entered Scapa Flow, They quickly realized that the British had dispersed their fleet after the outbreak of war. And after several patrolling warships proved out of range for U-47's torpedoes, Preen shot 4 torpedoes at the HMS Royal Oak, each failing to find their mark. Reloading yet again, his second salvo of 3 torpedoes decimated the Royal Oak, taking the lives of 833 men, including Rear Admiral Henry Blagrove. With German U-boats in full control of the Atlantic, a body of water some 41.1 million square miles in magnitude, Allied naval leaders scrambled to defend their limited naval assets at sea, along with the desperately needed supplies bound for Great Britain's war efforts. Convoys carrying supplies and troops to Britain were slow and had limited defensive technology. Planes could only escort a convoy so far before they had to turn back for fuel, making Allied ships easy prey for German submarines, who hunted in groups known as wolf packs, coordinating their attacks, often under the cover of darkness, with the objective of overwhelming convoy defenses. In 1941, German submarines were sinking ships faster than Allied shipyards could build them, while for every U-boat the Allies managed to sink, the Germans built 8 more as replacements. By the fall of 1942, some 2,000 merchant ships had been lost, along with thousands of men and millions of tons of much-needed cargo. Known respectively as the Mid-Atlantic Gap, the Greenland Gap, the Black Pit, or simply the Gap, this new and ominous no-man's land was essentially an area where air cover from either North America or Europe failed to adequately defend exposed merchant vessels and naval warships. Early in the war, the typical range of Allied aircraft, such as the consolidated B-24 Liberator or the Lockheed Hudson, was limited, leaving a stretch of Atlantic Ocean approximately 300 to 500 miles wide unprotected and exposed, in a gap extending roughly from the southern tip of Greenland to the Azores. U-boat commanders relied on signal intelligence and reconnaissance to determine when convoys departed from either England or North America, laying in wait along convoy routes once their prey had entered the gap. Without air cover, even escorting naval warships were at risk of wolfpack attacks, allowing German U-boats to operate on the surface without fear of airborne reprisals, which in turn enhanced their speed, maneuverability, and ability to sail close enough to enemy ships for the best odds of an accurate torpedo strike. Success after success bolstered the Germans' resolve, as well as their growing understanding that if they could effectively cut off the supply chain to England, they could potentially force the British into a position of capitulation. To that effect, in May of 1942, Dönitz ordered brazen U-boat attacks in the waters off North America, and when some of his U-boat crews entered Canada's Gulf of St. Lawrence, they managed to sink 21 ships in rapid succession. In response to mounting losses, the Allies made closing the Mid-Atlantic Gap a top priority in their fight against Nazi aggression. In early 1943, the Allies established air bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, and Greenland in an effort to extend air support over the gap, at the same time employing new long-range bombers equipped with the first-ever air-to-surface radar systems, which could penetrate the perpetual fog over the Grand Banks, a weather pattern that gave U-boats their advantage earlier in the war. The proliferation of Allied aircraft carriers and roving support groups of warships further degraded the U-boat's ability to hunt without impunity. Increased reconnaissance and anti-submarine patrols combined with advances in anti-sub warfare techniques, including sonar and new depth charge systems, which severely curtailed the Germans' ability to sink Allied ships. The Battle of the Atlantic reached its zenith in early 1943, when the Allies' new anti-sub technology managed to sink nearly 100 German U-boats in the first 5 months of the year, effectively turning the hunters of the early war into the hunted of the war's later years. The Mid-Atlantic Gap was at last closed by May of that same year, securing Allied Atlantic supply routes throughout the remainder of the war. And while the closure was not the ultimate conclusion of the Battle of the Atlantic, the Allies' new offensive techniques proved to be a decisive turning point in the war. In one of the most costly battles in world military history, not to mention the most costly war in human history, some 35,000 Allied merchant ships and 175 Allied warships were sunk, for a total loss of 14,500,000 gross tons. 741 RAF Coastal Command aircraft were also lost in anti-sub sorties, all at a cost of 36,200 naval personnel and 36,000 merchant seamen. German losses were equally egregious, including an estimated 30,000 U-boat sailors, all at a cost of 783 submarines and 47 surface warships, making the Battle of the Atlantic a time of unrestrained slaughter during the Second World War.